For most of our lives, we've been told the same basic formula for building financial security. Work hard, save money, invest regularly, stay out of debt. Do that consistently for a few decades, and eventually, things should work out. And to be fair, that's still good advice. But there's a part of the story that almost nobody talks about. Because the very things that help middle-class families build wealth can sometimes expose them to more taxes than they ever imagined. Not because they're doing anything wrong, not because they've become wealthy enough to fly private jets or own vacation homes, but because money gets taxed differently as it moves through different stages of life. And that's where a hidden problem begins to emerge. Some financial planners call it a double tax trap. And surprisingly, it often becomes most noticeable after age 40. At first, that idea sounds strange. After all, most people think taxes are simple. You earn income, you pay taxes. Whatever is left is yours. End of story. But real life isn't quite that straightforward. Because money doesn't just sit still after you earn it. It moves, it changes form, it grows, gets invested, gets spent, gets withdrawn, gets passed down, and every time it changes form, there's a chance another tax rule enters the picture. Think of money as taking a long journey. The moment a dollar enters your life, it begins passing through a series of checkpoints. And at many of those checkpoints, someone is standing there asking for a percentage. Imagine two neighbors. Both earn roughly the same income. Both live in similar houses. Both raise families. Both consider themselves comfortably middle class. But they make one different choice. The first neighbor spends most of what he earns. The second saves aggressively, invests consistently, and spends years preparing for retirement. Most people would agree the second neighbor is making smarter financial decisions. And generally speaking, he is. But something interesting happens over time. The more financially successful he becomes, the more complicated his relationship with taxes becomes. His savings generate interest. His investments produce gains. His retirement accounts create future withdrawal decisions. His assets increase in value. His estate gradually grows. And each of those developments introduces another interaction with the tax system. That's because taxes aren't only connected to work, they're connected to economic activity. That distinction sounds small, but it's incredibly important. Most people think taxes happen when money is earned. In reality, taxes often appear whenever money changes form. Income becomes savings. Savings become investments. Investments become gains. Gains become retirement income. Retirement income eventually becomes inheritance. Every step along that path may involve another layer of taxation. If you look at each tax separately, nothing seems unusual. But when you step back and look at the entire picture, a pattern starts to appear. And that pattern becomes especially important during middle age. Why? Because your 40s and 50s are often when every major financial responsibility arrives at the same time. Kids are expensive. Retirement suddenly feels close. Healthcare costs begin creeping higher. Parents may need support. The mortgage is still there. Career income is often at its peak. And for many families, their assets are larger than they've ever been before. In other words, life becomes financially complicated. And complexity creates its own problems. One of the most interesting findings in behavioral economics is that people don't necessarily make bad decisions because they're careless. Often they make bad decisions because the system becomes difficult to understand. The more complicated the rules become, the more likely people are to delay decisions, ignore opportunities, or make costly mistakes. Researchers have seen this repeatedly with retirement plans, investment choices, and tax strategies. Sometimes the biggest cost isn't the tax itself, it's understanding the tax. And that's where many middle-class families find themselves in a difficult position. Lower-income households often have fewer taxable assets to manage. Wealthier households can afford teams of advisors, accountants, and estate planners. Middle-class families frequently fall somewhere in between. They face growing financial complexity without always having professional guidance to help navigate it. And that's when the double tax trap becomes more than just a tax story. It becomes a wealth-building story. Because every dollar lost to taxes isn't just a dollar gone today. It's also a dollar that can no longer grow tomorrow. That's a concept many people underestimate. When we hear the word compounding, We usually think about investment returns. Money earns money, those gains earn more gains, and over time, wealth accelerates. But compounding works both ways. Costs compound too. Taxes compound, fees compound, inflation compounds, missed opportunities compound. A small leak repeated year after year can eventually drain far more wealth than most people realize. Imagine a family losing only a modest portion of investment growth each year due to various taxes and financial frictions. The annual impact might seem barely noticeable, but over decades, the difference can become substantial. That's why many economists focus less on headline returns and more on after-tax returns. Because creating wealth is only half the battle. Keeping wealth is the other half. And that becomes increasingly important as retirement approaches. Retirement introduces a challenge many people don't fully anticipate: the shift from building wealth to using wealth. During your working years, most decisions revolve around earning and saving. During retirement, the focus changes. Now the question becomes, how do you access the money you've spent decades accumulating? And that's where things can become surprisingly complicated. Withdrawals affect taxes. Taxes can affect benefits. Benefits can influence healthcare costs. Healthcare costs affect spending decisions. Everything becomes interconnected. The rules that applied while building wealth may not be the same rules that apply when using it. It's a little like spending years building a house, and only later realizing that ownership comes with ongoing expenses you never fully considered. The house may be finished. The costs continue. Money works much the same way. Building wealth is important, but managing wealth throughout its entire life cycle is equally important. And then there's another layer that often gets overlooked altogether: inflation. Unlike taxes, inflation doesn't send you a bill. There's no payment due date, no form to fill out, no obvious transaction taking place. Yet year after year, inflation quietly reduces purchasing power. Over long periods of time, that effect becomes enormous. A retirement account may look dramatically larger than it did 20 years ago. A house may be worth several times what it originally cost. Investment balances may seem impressive. But account balances and purchasing power aren't the same thing. And ultimately, people don't live on account balances. They live on what those balances can actually buy. $1 million means something very different today than it did decades ago. The number may be identical. The lifestyle it supports may not be. That's why financial success isn't really measured by how many dollars you accumulate. It's measured by how much purchasing power you preserve. And preserving purchasing power means fighting multiple battles at once: taxes, inflation, fees, complexity, behavioral mistakes. The double tax trap is simply one example of this larger reality. It reminds us that wealth isn't automatically protected just because it has been created. Wealth has to survive. In many ways, that's the lesson most people never hear. We spend so much time focusing on earning money because income is visible. The paycheck arrives, the number is clear, the achievement feels tangible. But long-term financial success is often determined by a different question. How much of that money actually survives? How much survives taxes? How much survives inflation? How much survives decades of financial friction? Those answers often matter more than people realize, especially after age 40, when financial decisions begin creating consequences that can last for the rest of your life. And that's the real takeaway here. The lesson isn't that taxes are unfair. The lesson isn't that saving and investing are mistakes. Far from it. The lesson is simply that money's journey is more complicated than most people think. Earning money is only the beginning. Keeping its value is the challenge that follows. Once you understand that, the double tax trap becomes easier to recognize. Not as a single event, not as one specific tax rule, but as a hidden pattern that appears whenever money moves through multiple stages of life. And perhaps that's the biggest surprise of all. For many middle-class families, the hardest part isn't making money. It's protecting the value of the money they've already earned. Because wealth isn't defined by how much money passes through your hands. It's defined by how much remains when the journey is over.